Well, I want to welcome everybody again, and it's really great to meet everybody in person and put a face to a name. And I'm really looking forward to spending the next day and a half talking about career-based, technology-based career training. So I'm going to start this session by talking a little bit about what the sector approach is, and then also give an introduction to employer engagement, what we've learned at the Justice Center about employer engagement. And then we're going to hear again from Scott and Christine Hopkins about the great partnership that they have in Tennessee, in a little more detail than we heard the first presentation. Uh-oh. Oh. It was working a minute ago. Okay. So I'd like to introduce our speakers. As we heard, Scott Crago is the plant manager at JSP International in Tullahoma, Tennessee, where he's been employed for more than 22 years, and he in that time worked his way up in the company. And Christine Hopkins is the executive director and also the founder of the Middle Tennessee Rural Reentry Program, which we sometimes call the MTRR program. And that program services incarcerated people in Franklin County, people who are incarcerated in the Franklin County Jail in Winchester, Tennessee. And Christine is also one of you. She's a 2015 Career Tech grantee. And many of you already know me because I provide technical assistance to Career Tech grantees, but I also work on employer engagement, federal workforce policy, and correctional education here at the Justice Center. Okay, start with the sector-based approach. So what is a sector-based approach? I'm going to start by talking about career sectors. They're a collection of occupations in one field. So let's say the medical field, for example. It's all the jobs in the medical field, from doctor, nurse, CNA, phlebotomist, x-ray technicians. All of those jobs make up the medical sector. And it's similar for other manufacturing, construction, other sectors. So economists and also the government measure employment and economic growth usually through sectors. And so you'll hear on the radio or read in the business section, you know, this sector is growing, this sector is slumping, and that's how we look at the economy in our country. So a sector-based approach addresses both supply and demand, which is also known as the need for people to get a job and the need for employers to hire people to fill their jobs. The sectors are usually, the health of a sector is usually considered regionally because people don't always just work and live in the same city. So for example, I live in Washington, D.C., but I work in Bethesda, Maryland. And I would work, you know, within 20 miles is Northern Virginia, Maryland, and DC, and I could imagine working in any of those areas. So, so the sector's considered regional. So one of the key components of the sector approach is that employers and workforce trainers or service providers talk to each other, so that we're not just training people for jobs that don't exist or that they can't get. Another best practice is taking a career path approach that we're going to talk about a little bit more in the next session. But basically the idea is that, yeah, people might enter at the bottom or an entry-level job, but there should be a way for them to move up. And that way is usually based on experience and more education. And so, you know, we heard in the first session about, you know, once somebody has some months of experience, that they might be ready for a promotion. So when we're thinking about job placement, we want to think about the future and what kind of career path is there. So A sectoral approach is also collaborative. So employers and training providers work together to create career pathways or identify career pathways. And in addition, corrections and workforce agencies work together with community-based organizations to identify opportunities and address barriers. For example, I think we all heard in the past about cases where somebody got a job and then their parole officer wanted to meet with them, at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. And so they had to leave their job. Maybe they didn't have a car. They'd have to drive, take 3 buses and basically take off the whole day just to meet with the parole officer. But we're seeing increasing improvements in that. So parole and probation is encouraging work by trying to organize meetings in a way that supports people staying on the job. So why use a sector-based approach? The answer is because it works. It results in increased earnings because it involves training people for jobs that usually pay more than minimum wage. And so a study by the Mott Foundation found that participants in a sector-based program actually earned 18% more than those in a control group. It also results in more satisfied employers because a sector-based approach helps them meet their need for skilled workers. A lot of the jobs that I'm talking about are actually called middle skilled jobs because they require less than a 4-year degree, but more than some kind of training more than a high school diploma. And this is actually where most of the job openings are in the country and where there are a lot of well-paying jobs. And this approach also cuts down on government waste because we don't want to be spending government money training people for jobs that don't exist or that existed 20 years ago when the program was developed. So as a result, both government funders and foundation funders are really supporting this sector-based approach. So I don't know how many of you are familiar with WIOA, which is the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, and that's the main federal, but it also goes state and local, funding stream in our country for workforce development. And written into WIOA, which is different than WIA, the program before, is actually requiring a sector-based approach. In addition, at the state level, there's 32 states around the country that actually have policies to support sector partnerships. And for those of you in the room now, I put a document in your USB stick, which is a 50-state scan of these policies, these sector-based partnership policies. It's a document published by the National Skills Coalition, and for those of you who may be watching in the future, you can always Google National Skills Coalition and find this. So in many cases, these policies take the form of funding streams to support sector partnerships, that is, partnerships between employers and training providers. So for example, in fiscal year 2016-17, the state of Pennsylvania provided $1.6 million in grants to 28 industry partnerships. And in the state of Massachusetts, in fiscal year 16, the state appropriated $2 million in grants to 14 organizations for sector partnerships. So this is state money that's in addition to any WIOA money that might be coming from the federal government. So I hope you take a good look at the document and see if what's going on in your state and if there's a way that you could form a partnership or join in on a partnership, and maybe this is might be one of your sustainability options for continuing your program. So now I'd like to take a minute to talk about an overview of employer engagement strategies before we hear from Craig and Christine. So we've identified 4 essential elements of an employer engagement strategy. And I want to start with some assumptions. And my first assumption is that employers don't usually hire people just to be nice. And they also don't hire people because they feel sorry for somebody who spent 25 years in prison. And they usually don't even do it because they think the improving the employment outcomes of formerly incarcerated people is good for society. Employers, and I think Scott's an example, they're going to hire formerly incarcerated people when it's in their interest to do so. So it's your job to find the sweet spot between where you need to, the workers that you need to place and what's an employer's need. So the first element is to do your research. And by that I mean find out about the career paths in your community, the licensing restrictions, any state and local hiring policies, and find out about the growth industries in your community, which industries are growing, which industries maybe are dying or seeing reduced rates of hiring. The second is to listen to employers. Now, when you talk to employers, ask them questions. Find out more about what their concerns are. And I would suggest when you're talking to an employer at first, you should be listening more than you're talking. And listen to, like what Craig was saying. Well, he had 50% turnover. He was having trouble keeping people. Well, that's something that when an employer says that, listen to how you can address that concern. And if an employer says, well, I can't find people with this skill, well, maybe you can work out a training program in your facility that can train people for that job that exists. Because employers are going to hire people, again, that help them address their needs. The third, excuse me. The third is to promote peer learning among employers. And somebody asked Scott earlier, have you talked to other employers in your industry? Well, if you have an employer that's been hiring your people and been happy with them, ask them if they can talk to other employers in their industry. Can they speak to like a meeting of an association? Can they speak to the Chamber of Commerce in their community? Can they call up their friends who might be in a similar boat? And the fourth is to look for ways to create win-win opportunities with employers. And also with workforce boards and community-based organizations. So again, you're focusing on both people meeting the needs of both sides. So when should you engage employers? And the answer is at every step of your program. And we're going to hear a little bit more from Christine and Scott about when this has happened practically for them. But it's not enough to wait to talk to an employer until you have 10 people coming out of your program looking for a job. It has to start much earlier. So I want to start by asking Christine if you can talk a little bit more about just give a little background about your program and how you put this into practice.
Okay. Middle Tennessee Rural Reentry is a 501c organization. It started in July the 1st of 2007. It was the first comprehensive reentry program in a rural county of Tennessee. It actually started as a result of Sheriff Tim Fuller, who serves on the National Board of Sheriff's Association, said in a campaign speech when he was running for sheriff, locking people up and throwing away the key is not the answer. Rehabilitation is the answer. Well, I just happened to be in the audience, and had spent 32 years of my life working with rehabilitation for people with disabilities. The man said to me, that can work. So I went up to him as soon as the speech was over and said, are you serious? And he said, yes, I am. And I said, give me 2 or 3 months and we'll have a rehabilitation program running. So it took about roughly 90 days to find the funding to start the program. We started with 2 people. We're on the campus of the jail. Franklin County Jail serves around, actually about 3,500 individuals will go through this jail annually. And our goal is to help reduce the recidivism. Franklin County Jail, along with the other counties in surrounding areas, the recidivism rate is approximately 80%. Middle Tennessee Rural Reentry with Intervention has a recidivism rate of approximately 30%. That's a huge difference. And as I listened to Scott and Haley this morning, it made me proud to know that we're there to maybe help those opportunities happen for people who need that extra help. We provide a lot of services. One of the major services, of course, is the technology program. The South has gained a lot of industries that are of the automotive industries. We actually have Nissan in Decker, Tennessee, which is about 3 miles from Winchester. We have Huntsville, Alabama, is about 50 miles away. We have Honda and a lot of other places that the suppliers are feeding into. So a lot of the suppliers need a lot of people doing plastics and injection molding. So one of the first things that we did, and I can bring this in later, but was to sit down with the heads of those employers before we ever wrote the grant and said, if we can write a grant to provide training to those in the reentry program that we know there's jobs in when they are released, what would it be in? And they said injection molding.
Okay. So I know that Scott is just one of the employers that you work with.
Yes. We have a good relationship. When we first started, that was not true. In fact, like Scott, they had an attitude. No, if you're incarcerated, and I'm trying to keep from coughing, y'all, but if they were incarcerated, you would get some dishwashing jobs, working at a sawmill, a lot of the jobs that paid minimum wage. You cannot live on minimum wage in this economy. There's no way. So why should we expect, if we can't live, why should we expect folks coming out of incarceration to be able to make it? So that's why the technology training program, we actually received the Second Chance Act grant in 2011. And we provided, in that particular case, computer information technology. That's why, though, it was important, I think, if you really want to help someone, give them a skill that's going to last a lifetime. In my lifetime, I can assure you, automobiles will continue to be. So that's why we're doing injection molding. I serve on the state workforce opportunity board, the WIOA, and I'm trying to work with them to establish programs throughout the state of Tennessee. And it's going to be really important that we establish training programs where the training is in conjunction with employers. Mm-hmm. So now in Franklin County, Tennessee, all of the employers, with the exception of Children's Child Care and Arnold Engineering Development Center, some of the folks that are more reluctant, all of the employers, especially all of the industries, are hiring our individuals.
So when you applied for the grant, you got the grant, and then you go back and work out the details of what you're actually going to do with the money and the program that you're going to set up. Did you talk to employers then too, like for input on designing your course, or if their interest or anything like that?
Yes, and we'll continue to still do that. Mm-hmm. We have a software package in the training program itself that takes up about half of the day of the actual training. Well, the training is running for 10 weeks, 364 hours, through a partnership with the Tennessee College of Applied Technology in Pulaski, Tennessee. This was an MOU that we developed with them. It's bona fide post-secondary training, and we want to make sure that the employers that we're producing not a product, I guess you would say, but an employee that's going to be able to start immediately in their job with some additional training. So we do contact our employers, and they've been assisting us in providing some materials, hands-on materials that we're able to use to have more training with hands-on.
Okay. And then, Scott, you talked about that you actually go and speak to each class in the facility. Can you talk a little bit more about what you do? Like, what do you think the purpose is, and what you're trying to tell them when you go and speak?
I think the thing I touch on when I speak with the class is just preparing them for the interview process. What does the employer look for from a candidate that's coming through the door to interview? You know, if your interview's at 8 a.m., 7:50 you need to be there. Dressed appropriately. And I speak very frank with them. The tattoos on the neck and the tattoos on the arms and all that. We don't need to see that. Don't need to have shorts and tank tops. Is this one working? I'm sorry. Come prepared. Turn the cell phone off. How many times I've actually had them sit in an interview with me, and I end it right there. They're on their cell phone. Put the cell phone down, and just preparing them for the interview and what an employer looks for. And it has been beneficial. We did the same thing with Miss Haley.
Okay. And are there any recommendations that you'd give to the rest of the group about when and how to engage employers?
Oh, I think you need to engage right from the very beginning. I mean, you need to find that employer, and like JSP, I'll use, that has working with the program, and use them as your spokesperson, your model to speak to other industries, other companies to bring this program on. You need that one company that's willing to take that step forward and go with the program.
Okay. So, Christine, I want to ask you a little bit about, what do you tell employers about why they should hire your graduates?
Well, we like to think that we're working for the employer as well as the person that we're sending to them. Michelle, who works heavy with these employers, and she's here with me today along with Dale Hatcher, the assistant director. You've got to know those benefits that employers, and work with them and let them know that the work opportunity tax credit break is there, that they can take advantage of. Help them with the materials if they need that. The bonding authority, you've got to let them know that. WIOA in Tennessee recently, we went from 50% to 75% OJT that they can pay an employer to hire an individual to do OJT. Now, while we're providing the training, it is important to understand there's going to be additional training. So it may not be 6 months through WIOA. It may just be an additional month for additional hands-on training that they would need. So we're working with them to try to make sure that that break is out there.
Okay.
And we also let them know that we will follow through for anything that happens. If, say, an employee is missing work, Michelle is constantly on that phone talking with them about the importance of being there every day, to let them know we are there if you need us. Okay. And we will work with that employee.
Let me just ask the group for a second. How many people have heard, you mentioned 3 federal programs through Federal Department of Labor funding, the Work Opportunity Tax Credit, the Federal Bonding Program, and on-the-job training. How many people have heard of all 3 of these programs? Okay, most people, just to give a very quick overview, the Work Opportunity Tax Credit is a federal tax credit for employers who hire people from different groups that face barriers to employment. So people who are getting, TANF, welfare, and formerly incarcerated people will fall into one of those groups. And so you get a tax credit for hiring that person. And it varies, but it's in the area of a couple $1,000s. And then the federal bonding program, I know people worry about, well, what if what an employer might be concerned about, am I insured, if something happens when I hire a formerly incarcerated person? Well, you can bond them through the federal bonding program, and that would be free to employers. And then on-the-job training is a part of the WIOA that's administrated through the workforce centers, which are located in communities throughout the country. And basically what it is it'll offer an employer a subsidy if they hire a person and as they get trained, and then hopefully the employer, once they're trained for the job, the employer will hire them on or continue to hire them without the subsidy. So if it gives the employers a little benefit of like, well, if this person isn't trained for your job, well, you can get federal support for doing that.
We have a governing board of directors, and a lot of those individuals, there's only 9 on that board, but we're trying to make sure that we're bringing on, as vacancies occur, as many employers as possible, because it's going to be really important if you're going to be preparing individuals for the workforce. It's very important to make sure you're listening to employers to know what those needs are.
Right.
And for years, education, the Workforce Investment Act, all of those employers that are working with people, their challenges, what are they preparing them to do? And if you're not working with employers to make sure what their needs are, you are wasting dollars.
Mm-hmm.
So it's going to be, it is critical, not going to be, but is critical, that we continue to work with those employers, let them know that we're working for them, let them know that we're providing training that's going to meet their needs. We had an employer in a couple of weeks ago from Manchester who told the class when he finished, if you were in street clothes, I would hire all 8 of you today. They have 1,300 employees inside of their plant. And they sat there like Scott was talking about, encouraging them to go on to school. And he said, if you will take that class, we will start you out at $24 an hour. I guess if I had anything to say to the other guarantees in this audience today, folks, the opportunity is out there. But we've got to get to know our employers and what their needs are to really affect what takes place and what happens to those being released to where they will not return to incarceration.
Okay, thanks. Now, Scott, you talked, and I think Christine mentioned that you were kind of reluctant at first when you heard, hire some of Christine's idea. So can you tell a little bit more about, what convinced you to take a chance on these candidates and what's helped you to, you mentioned the reduction in turnover. Is there anything else?
Yeah, the reduction in turnover, the attending the graduation, seeing the curriculum they were being taught. And again, I was in the same first class I spoke with. I'd have hired all 8 of them right there. Aside of the Franklin County orange jumpsuit, they'd have been in street clothes. I'd have hired them as well.
Why do you say that? Like, what was it about them that made you think that?
Just looking at them, looking in their eyes, seeing how devoted they were to to the course, as well as how attentive they were in the class when I was speaking to them, eye contact, not, goofing off as per se. And just, hey, give me that chance. And that's the person I want. Someone that's willing to step up, and I'll give them a chance. Show me what you can do.
Okay, great. And so I'm guessing that some of that was built into the training program, so that by the time Scott came in, they were already, showing up on time, and they were looking people in the eye, and they felt more confident. So when I asked Christine, when we were talking about preparing for this workshop, I asked her, what were the main challenges that you faced? And I put some of the main challenges that she mentioned up here on the slide. Hiring cycles may not align with, when an employer wants to hire somebody, may not be the same time that your training program ends. Employers may ask, and Scott mentioned this, like you had a condition before that you wanted people to have a high school diploma, but once you looked at it more closely, maybe that you didn't really require the high school diploma skills.
Correct.
But so sometimes employers have these credential requirements. Employers just are going to be reluctant, a lot of employers are going to be reluctant to hire people who have a criminal record. And then Christine also mentioned that sometimes it's hard to reach the hiring person in order to, make your pitch. So I want to ask both of you some ideas about ways that you've found to address some of these challenges.
Our addressing of the hiring cycle was once we got in, learned this class curriculum, 10 weeks, when the graduations were coming up, we were able to build a pool of individuals to keep our crews full throughout that period. And then as we saw graduation coming up, if we had individuals that we were interested in at that time, we scheduled our orientation within that week. So within a week of their release date. We actually had an orientation, Chris in particular was released at 2:30 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, and we had orientation Wednesday, Thursday for him to start. So we've worked our schedule to grasp as many of them as we can coming out of there in terms of to fall with our orientation process. We typically do not like to do an orientation class. About every 4 to 6 weeks is when we do an orientation class, because we need time to get the individual we just brought in up to speed and trained before we threw another whole group out there with our trainers and our supervisors. So we coordinated it with them.
Okay.
And along those same lines, it is important on a timely basis to make sure that they know where they're going. I mean, when we think of our own selves, if you did not know in the morning what your schedule was, what are you going to be doing, you're kind of lost. And that, if the individuals return home, our experience has been without a promise of employment, nothing to look forward to, sometimes the reverting to the drugs happens. So that is important to make sure that they know ahead of time as much as possible to make that happen. And then I think in the interview they get a feel of whether they're going to be employed or not, and the employer knows that whether they're going to even consider them or not. Mm-hmm. And the way we address when we wrote the grant, the Second Chance Act grant, we wrote it that they would have the aptitude, and we test for aptitude. Because if you're going in post-secondary college training, you've got to have the aptitude to succeed. So we want to make sure that they have the aptitude. But we also wrote that they would be a high school graduate. Well, when half of your jail are people with non-high school credential, we offer the GED. Mr. Hatcher is very much involved in that through adult basic education program through workforce. Mm-hmm. So now the majority of the class do have their high school, but we will take people that doesn't as well and work with them during the training, during the class. And Miss Erica back here was very much involved in helping me to accomplish that. So we received approval from the Second Chance Act to let that happen.
Okay. And I think we talked a little bit about educating employers about the benefits of hiring your people. I want to mention the last bullet here, because sometimes it is hard to reach the hiring manager. I mean, sometimes they're not listed on the website. It's even hard to find out who, like, the HR director is in a company, let alone, you know, to make an appointment to meet with them, or the head of a company or a plant manager, decision makers.
Yep. Chamber of Commerce, great place to start. We also have an industrial board within Coffee, Franklin County, Warren County.
Mm-hmm.
We have a plant managers association. So those are the areas to go and reach out.
And I want to mention that these groups are interested in hearing from you. And so one of the projects of the Justice Center is actually we're providing a grant to help chambers of commerce learn more about the benefits of hiring people with criminal records. And the National Association of Chamber of Commerce Executives that we're working with is actually providing technical assistance to chambers throughout the country and producing materials that can be distributed to chambers. And they're finding a really strong interest in this. There are a lot of employers out there who are having trouble finding people to fill their positions or retaining people, and they're looking for solutions. And we're in a good economy, and employers are a lot more open now than they might be at another time to look at people that they otherwise might have overlooked.
If reentry programs, if they don't belong to the chamber, we should, because that's the best place in the world to meet
Right.
those presidents of those companies and actually get to know them very well.
Right. You know, and chambers and Rotary clubs provide educational programming. So if you go and they're easy to find. They have websites and people that you can contact. You know, tell them what you're doing and see if they're interested in having a presenter. It's not as hard as connecting with an HR manager. So, I wanted to just mention here employer engagement after job placement, and we've talked about it a little bit already. And Christine said, and Scott said, work with employers to solve problems after placement. Things are going to come up in people's lives, and the more that you can be an asset to the company by offering to help smooth that over or address the problem, the more you're going to be a help to the employer. And Scott's going to talk more about employers' ongoing skills training for moving up, and we've also talked a little bit about encouraging employers to become champions for your program. If you have an employer that's happy with you, ask them to become a champion, and a lot of them are going to be like Scott and say, sure, I'd love to. So I think we're out of time here, and we're going to take a 15-minute break, and we're going to come back and talk a little bit more about the sectoral approach after this. So I'd like everyone to give a hand to the presenters.
We do have brochures on our program to hand out. We do have brochures
Oh, okay.
for everyone if they'd like.